What I would like to do is talk a little bit about the situation with Queen Elizabeth when she came to the throne in England, what that kind of meant for England, for the church in England, some of the difficulties and some of the problems that arose, and the unexpected appearance of the Counter-Reformation in England in 1580-81 with the coming of St. Edmund Campion and Father Robert Parsons. But first of all, I think that, you know, as we go through school, there's this terrible prejudice against history. Everybody always, you know, yawns and oh no when you have to study history. And we're used to those dreadful textbooks that are just kind of go on and put you to sleep as you try to read them and so forth. But you know, history is a wonderful, wonderful medium for us to learn, to understand, to know not only great events, but our modern age and ourselves. When I was a student at the University of Innsbruck, I lived in a house called the Canisianum, named after St. Peter Canisius, one of the great giants of the Counter-Reformation. And in the house was an aging Jesuit priest with Parkinson's disease, Father Hugo Rahner. And he was a wonderful, wonderful, very funny and kind old man at the time. And they just had a special edition of a magazine from there, kind of celebrating his 100th birthday. He was long dead, but it was the 100th anniversary of his birth, I guess we say, when someone is dead. And in there was a fascinating analysis of Father Hugo Rahner as a historian. And it's a great line. And it says, just as theology cannot stand on its own, neither can history be taken isolated by itself. That history is useless if its theological implications are not, useless was the wrong word. History was lifeless, I think, was the quote, if its theological implications are not seen. And so history becomes a way of studying theology, because theology remains that great quest, that great search for some kind of touching of the transcendent, for some kind of knowledge of God, some kind of understanding of our relationship with God, and therefore of ourselves. What I'd like to do then is propose this. The historian has a role to play. The role is kind of like as a painter. You go back, you retrieve images, you retrieve characters, you retrieve information, and then you put it together in kind of a picture. But every artist knows that when you paint a picture, you begin the interpretation. And the Christian historian begins the theological interpretation of the event by the very way that they present the information. What I would like to do tonight is take some information from the age of Elizabeth and then look at it in such a way that we have a chance to glimpse the implications of this story in our own time, in our own age. And when I do that, I'd like to rely on a modern journalist, actually, and draw some comparisons and leave us not with an enormous number of answers, but with an enormous number of questions to ponder about ourselves and our age and our time. Elizabeth, Queen Mary I of England, Mary Tudor, died on the 17th of November, 1558. There was a struggle for succession because the obvious heir, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, was Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was, by all accounts, illegitimate. We know the story of the divorce, of the attempt of Henry VIII to get an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, and that when he was unable to do so, he divorced her anyway. He married Anne Boleyn, who was a very clever woman, because she said, our relationship goes nowhere unless I'm the queen. And so he pushed her, she pushed him into a divorce and to marry her to make her at least have a shot that her heirs would rule England. They had only one child before Henry beheaded Anne Boleyn, and that child was Princess Elizabeth. Elizabeth came to the throne with a great deal of confusion and doubt as about the legitimacy of her succession. And so she took some compromising steps at the very beginning. Henry VIII had still thought of himself as a Catholic, that he had latched on to that old medieval idea, the pre-Gregory VII idea that somehow or other the sovereign ruler is above the Pope. And he latched on to that historical thread, and I think we talked about that last year, that historical thread where the great struggle began between the papacy and the civil rulers, the secular rulers. But his son fell in with the Seymours, who were radical Protestants, and they moved the young king more and more and more into the Reformed mode. 2 prayer books came out during the reign of Edward VI. The first prayer book, and obviously the second prayer book. The first prayer book, was very much a rewording of the Roman Missal. But Archbishop Cranmer, who was a Protestant, became more and more, moved more and more and more toward a radical stance against Catholicism. And although he was really the author of the prayer book, he at the same time was dissatisfied with it. And I'd like to give you a quote to see where Cranmer was going. The Archbishop had publicly maintained his belief in the real presence in 1537. But by 1550 he could write, and this is a quote, "What availeth it to take away beads, pardons, pilgrimages, and such other like popery, so long as 2 chief roots remain unpulled up? The very body of the tree, or rather the roots of the weeds, is the popish doctrine of transubstantiation, of the real presence of Christ's flesh and blood in the sacrament of the altar, and of the sacrifice and oblation of Christ made by the priest for the salvation of the quick and the dead." Cranmer had moved now beyond the heart and the core of Roman Catholicism. He had begun to deny the real presence, this is the Archbishop of Canterbury, begun to deny the real presence in the Blessed Sacrament. And so there came out the second book of Common Prayer, in which the whole notion of real presence was removed, and a much more radical stance was taken, a much more Protestant stance was taken toward the real presence. When Elizabeth came to the throne, she was faced with a country, and I heard the speaker before me quoting from the book of Eamon Duffy and the stripping of the altars, that idea that Catholicism was alive and strong and well in England when Elizabeth came to the throne. Since her throne was unsteady and insecure, she passed what was called, there were 2 major acts of her first year as queen in 1559. The Act of Supremacy, in which she changed her father's position a little bit. Henry claimed himself to be the head of the Church of England, and he saw himself therefore as the Pope in England, as well as the king. Elizabeth changed that to the Governor General of the Church. And that's an important change, because she's moving more and more toward having jurisdiction over the Church, and she's moving away from making all sorts of claims about having some kind of a religious position as the spiritual head of the Church of England. And the second thing she did in 1559 was she passed the Act of Uniformity, which combined the 2 Edwardian books of Common Prayer, and in combining them, she left ambiguous, and this was Elizabeth to a T, she left ambiguous the question of the real presence. Catholics, she said, can interpret it in their way, and the Protestants can interpret it in theirs, and therefore there should be peace in the realm. She also passed a law that's saying that everyone had to attend the official church at the fine of a shilling when they missed Sunday services. And she was not terribly concerned whether the priest who presided at those Sunday services believed in the real presence or did not believe in the real presence, as long as they outwardly conformed to the religious ritual of the new Church of England. In order to do this, Elizabeth insisted that the outward appearance of the Church of England be Catholic, because the majority of people were still Catholic, and she did not want popular discontent and popular revolution because she herself was quite insecure on the throne. The second thing that she wanted in all of this was not to be threatening to the great Catholic nobles, especially of the North, to let everything kind of be. And this she was assisted in by her able minister, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. And they together, and I'm going to read you another quote out of this also, out of the historian Roger Lockyer, that says, "The aim of Elizabeth and Cecil was not to wipe out Roman Catholicism by violent suppression, but to let it die a natural death through lethargy and outward conformity. And in this, they came very near to success." What happened then that changed this very peaceful movement that Elizabeth intended? What happened then that kept this accommodation and this lethargy from bringing about a peaceful change? Elizabeth also was very comfortable with the theology of the Church of England becoming Calvinist, becoming Protestant. She didn't care what they thought as long as it looked like what her father had done, as long as it looked like the Roman ritual. She said herself, in dealing with the questions of religion in the realm of England, "I do not want to open windows into men's souls." Religion was not something she was terribly interested in imposing upon her people. She wanted uniformity, conformity, and everything to be peaceful enough for her to secure her place on the throne of England. A few things jarred this terribly. In 1570, Pope Pius V, Michael Ghislieri, excommunicated Elizabeth. And this cut off then forever the facade of a Catholic England. It was a very controversial act, and among historians is a very controversial act today, because it started to increase the persecution of Catholics in England. One of the things in reaction to the excommunication of Queen Elizabeth was the upping of the fines for missing services. At first, she said, they didn't have communion very frequently, so a shilling here, a shilling there, what difference does it make? If the Catholics want to go on a regular Sunday and there's no communion, that's fine, but when communion's there and they don't show up, that's a shilling. That's not so bad. And a lot of the sheriffs and justices of the peace and so forth didn't enforce it. After the excommunication, she became more adamant that everybody attend, and she raised the fine. The fine was to end up £20 for every time you missed service, eventually. And so, naturally, the Catholics began to sink, those who remained faithful began to sink deeper and deeper into economic difficulty and hardship. The state of Catholicism then became more and more the state of the impoverished within England. But something even more dramatic than the excommunication happened in England to unsettle this Elizabethan settlement. And that which happened to make it all a little bit less secure were the coming of the Counter-Reformation priests, the Jesuits especially. under the leadership of Robert Parsons, and who was a companion coming into England in 1580 of Edmund Campion. Well, most of us know the story of Edmund Campion. It's an interesting thing for a Jesuit. You know, one of the great things about the early Jesuits was obedience. Edmund Campion, if you read Evelyn Waugh's life of Edmund Campion, one of the reasons that Campion got caught was because he disobeyed Parsons, who told him, don't ever go back to the same place, no matter what happens. And he was enticed to returning, and of course they were waiting for him. He was one of the bright lights of England before his conversion. He was a great student in Oxford, and Elizabeth, you went to Oxford to hear him debate, and she was enthralled with him. And when he turned Catholic, she was furious, because it was a very personal kind of betrayal in her mind. So, Campion was caught, and Campion was killed. Parsons himself was busy setting up a Catholic printing press outside of London. But then he left England and came back to the continent because he had some very important work that he felt that he had to do. And that was to ensure a Catholic succession to the throne of England. And so as the priests came, and Parsons said, they can kill us all they want, but more will come. And that when it's all said and done, Elizabeth executed 183 priests. She also, in a rising of the Catholic lords of the North, in revenge, picked one person, innocent, guilty, didn't matter, out of every village and town that had in any way cooperated with the rebellion of the Catholic lords of the North, and she had 400 of them hung, drawn, and quartered, as an example of what would happen to a revolutionary. You know, when we pick up the English history books and we read about Bloody Mary, you know, I think maybe it's something that could be rethought. One of the things that Parsons set out to do was to provide a theory of government that would enable religion to become a criteria of suitability for the position of prince or king. One of the things he also did was to take the whole office of king and reach back into history, whether there's no indication of what Parsons actually read, but these theories that he was coming up with about government were theories that were from the 13th and early 14th century also. The theories of Marsilio of Padua, of John of Paris, of William of Ockham, and so forth. Parsons said, essentially, that all authority and power in the secular realm belongs essentially to the people. It is in a sacred contract with the prince that the prince has a right to rule. And it is the commonwealth, the people. Commonwealth means the common good, the community of the community that strives for the good. That it is up to the community, the commonweal, the commonwealth, to establish the parameters of the authority of the king. And they do this, Parsons says, in the coronation oath. So the contract between the people and the king is articulated in the coronation oath. And it is in the construction of that oath that the limitations are declared on the reigning monarch. Now, Parsons, in his literature, and the English hated him, Parsons in that literature said, the whole purpose of government is to provide for the happiness, the good of the people. Parsons also said that heresy was not something beneficial for the common good. And therefore he established as a criteria for the legitimacy of a ruler their orthodoxy and their incorporation into the Christian church, the ancient Christian church of the West, the Church of Rome. Well, we could say, here's, this Jesuit on the continent saying all of these things. Well, what difference does it make? The difference it makes is that by the hundreds, the priests were entering into England. They were bringing many secretly back to the faith. Elizabeth was terrified of them, and she struck out violently against them. If any of you, how many of you have ever read any of the accounts of the death of the English martyrs? Have any of you ever read them? They're gruesome things, and they're almost always done with betrayal and trickery and lies and all of that kind of stuff. You can see the level of fear in those who were attacking by the kinds of punishment. They're hung before they're dead, they're sliced open, and they're disemboweled, and they're all of this kind of thing. And that, we just celebrated not too long ago the death of the North American martyrs. And Jean de Brebeuf, he had, while he was alive, his heart pulled out and eaten in front of him and so forth. We said, oh my gosh, how savage, how barbaric that is. Well, the English were doing the same thing 100 years earlier under Queen Elizabeth. And so what the fear that was generated in the English and in Elizabeth by this wave after wave, especially of the Jesuit priests, who were the forerunners and who were kind of the leaders of the counter-reform, were pouring into England, and many were converting back to the true faith. This alarming situation led to brutal repression and persecution. Eventually, Parsons had put an enormous amount of hope on the conversion of James VI of Scotland to Catholicism. His mother was Mary, Queen of Scots, and he always felt that there was some way that James could come back to his mother's faith and so forth. He was, of course, to be disappointed. Elizabeth died in 1603. James came to the throne very clearly a Protestant, and Parsons died in 1610. So in his mind, his whole endeavor had failed. But he had done a number of very important things. One of them was to articulate a fairly revolutionary new understanding of the role of government within human society. And he also articulated the value that somehow or other the relationship with God was a primary consideration in the choice of a ruler. But here we have something else emerge now. Parsons did not go unchallenged. The Jesuits did not go unchallenged among the English Catholics themselves. There was a prison in Cambridgeshire named Wisbeck Castle, and in there is where they retained a group of secular clergy who were allowed to celebrate Mass, preach to one another, even give instruction to the local people. It was just kind of a halfway house, I suppose we'd call it today. And they had come to a position of trying to protect the civil rights and the secular rights of English Catholics. And they were very much enamored of the program of generosity of Elizabeth and Cecil. And they became alarmed also at the coming of the Counter-Reformation to England. And they appealed to Rome and asked for some kind of autonomy and some kind of restraint on the missionary priests who were coming into England. Rome responded by appointing an archpriest named George Blackwell. Blackwell came in 1597, and he immediately began to side with the Counter-Reformation movement. The secular clergy who were imprisoned at Wisbeck Castle broke off into a group, and they appealed the archpriest's appointment to Rome, and were therefore called the appellants. They began to move in a very different way. Catholicism started to become split within England between the forces of the Counter-Reformation and the forces of the traditional English life. In this appellant controversy, as it was called, they began to develop, led by a priest named Christopher Bagshaw, they began to develop another theory of government in which they said the civil ruler is independent of the spiritual ruler. The Pope has every right over us as a spiritual ruler, but in all matters pertaining to the state, we must obey the monarch. They took that a little bit further and said we have to obey the monarch because the monarch is appointed divinely by God. And so we have now 2 points of authority: authority over the body and authority over the soul. By making this distinction, they were able then to capitulate to the Elizabethan settlement, while at the same time retaining their identity as Roman Catholics in their minds. They also believed that natural generation was the way that a legitimate ruler came to office. Parsons said no. Anyone, as long as they are chosen by the people, accepted by the people, and conform to the coronation oath, is able to become a prince. The appellant said, not so. Only those who are born into it, thereby indicating their selection by God, are able to rule. Now, where does this put them in relationship to Queen Elizabeth? On her side. They're willing to bear the burden of outward conformity in order to preserve what they see as the peace of the Catholics in England. This became a continuing struggle within the story of English Catholicism until eventually the reign of Cromwell and the English Civil War and the vicious penal laws that were imposed upon Catholics, and bringing finally in their minds to an end the threat of Catholicism. It was, of course, to rise up again in 1688 with when James II married Mary of Modena, a Catholic, and had an heir. And this was, of course, when a great coup d'etat took place, which the English euphemistically called the Glorious Revolution. But that's beyond what we're talking about. What I said in the beginning was that if we want to paint a picture, I hope I've painted a little bit of a picture. You see Elizabeth, you see insecurity, you see fear, you see accommodation, you see a clever plan to kind of let everything just kind of drift into some kind of conformity. You hear her saying, I don't want to open windows into men's souls. You hear her and you see her moving toward Protestant theology because that allows her the independence and the freedom to function as she wants, is the Governor General of the Church of England, and yet you see her insisting on an outward conformity, on a kind of look. How many times have you ever heard someone say, well, the Episcopal Church is pretty much like our own, you can hardly tell the difference. That's the Elizabethan settlement, it's clever. Anyway, what I said, though, was once this picture gets painted, now we have to look at it because, historical phenomena are seldom restricted in time. They simply have different forms and shapes. Now, a lot of people will say, well, then history repeats itself. Not so, I don't think. What I think the issue is that the human is a finite being. You provide a variety of possibilities, and within the realm of the finite, they will find their solutions in different times and places. So basically, what happens is we gain an insight into the functioning not of cyclical history, which it isn't, but we gain an insight into human behavior and human means of thought. Because what I would like to do now is move forward a little bit in time, say to 2006. And I would like to look at some things that are any of you familiar with that website, www.chiesa.com? It's interesting. And it's very fine. And there's an Italian journalist by the name of Msgr that writes most of the articles in it. It's very analytical. It's usually he knows an awful lot about the church and about the world that it functions in. And he has written a report that says after Verona, how many of you remember that Benedict XVI was just in Verona at a theological conference and gave a talk in October? It says October 26th, no less, okay? So fairly recently. Benedict met with the leaders of the Italian Church, and Msgr looks into this and tells us what happened. And it's really interesting. He sees a tremendous clash of cultures going on. And he finds here in Verona the dream of what they call religious choice. Religious choice is a motto. It's kind of a jargon in the Italian church. It was synonymous with a church that would be docile and friendly toward modernity, silently mixed together with the forces of progress, invisible like yeast in the dough, concentrated on the spiritual and on the primary of the individual conscience. This, he says, was the mood at Verona. Now, keep in mind our little 16th century story. In Verona, this dream was burnished by Cardinal Martini's successor to the See of Milan, Cardinal Diogenes Tettamanzi. The inaugural address fell to him. This is Msgr talking. And Tettamanzi, true to form, turned this into an address on the succession and the opposition to Benedict's appointee, Cardinal Ruini. Tettamanzi promised a return to the source, to the deliberately optimistic spirit with which the Vatican Council looked at the modern world in the 1960s, sowing instead of depressing diagnoses, encouraging remedies instead of gloomy forecasts, messages of confidence. On the interpretation of the Council's F, Tettamanzi highlighted a statement by Paul VI, but completely passed over the theses illustrated by Benedict XVI in his address to the Roman Curia on December the 22nd, when he was highly critical of the idea of Vatican II as a new beginning for church history across the board. Tettamanzi then began to attack the more aggressive and the more public forms of Christianity and Christian manifestation. And instead, he pushed the interweaving of Christianity and modernity. This is Tettamanzi. And I brought this, not so that I could read it to you actually, but there's some things that he says that I couldn't repeat without making it sound like I was making it up. So I want to quote it, okay? In the Cathedral Church of Milan, the famous Duomo of Milan, at the Requiem Mass for Gianni Versace in 1997, Elton John played and sang Candle in the Wind. The cathedra, the chair of the non-believers, created by Cardinal Martini, has hosted highly popular secular personalities, not to praise Christianity, but to reawaken within Christians as well the non-believer within us. During Lent, for meditation on the last words of Christ on the cross, the readings in the Duomo were not from the four Gospels, but from the writings of Oscar Wilde, Marguerite Yourcenar, I don't know who she is, Pier Paolo Pasolini, and Jack Kerouac. At Pentecost, there were recitations from the works of the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, and the debut of a musical composition by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in a video display by the Japanese abstract artist Tatsuo Miyajima. Finally, in the crypt beneath the main altar, beside the relics of St. Charles Borromeo, who together with St. Ambrose is the patron of Milan, a cubbyhole was set up with the title Via Dolorosa, within which, in darkness, one could watch an 18-minute video of images with no sound and almost entirely in black, the stated aim to bring the visitor into a cloud of unknowing in which he finally faces the free decision to believe or not believe. This, then, was, during the first 3 days in Verona, the Teramanzi effect had stunning success until Benedict XVI arrived. And pulverized what had held the stage until then. L'Osservatore Romano, on the mark for once, Msgr says, printed the papal address between a full-page headline to restore full citizenship to the Christian faith. This means the public citizenship, equivalent in secular terms of Christians capable of saying no, but above all of saying yes to everything that is right, true, and pure in cultures and civilizations. In short, that great yes, that in Jesus Christ God has spoken to man and to his life. This is, in essence, the Pope said, the cultural project conceived and implemented for the Italian Church by Cardinal Ruini. Then we hear this, listen, Teramanzi will still be able to draw strength from the Catholic sector of conciliar bent, religious choice, made up of some bishops, many priests, and a great many lay people in church employ. But that's not where the Church of the people upon which Benedict XVI has placed his bet. As a theologian, Joseph Ratzinger said he wanted to defend the faith of ordinary people. The real followers of Ratzinger in Italy are among the ordinary Catholics, those who listen to Radio Maria, those who support the movement for life, the millions of faithful who go to Mass on Sunday and are asking this Pope not to remain silent, but to speak as he knows so well how to do. Now, here we have a modern journalistic analysis of a tremendously deep and important cultural conflict within Catholicism in Italy, one of the most traditionally Catholic countries in Europe and in the world. What we see on one hand is the appellants. You know, you're not going to make progress in the spreading of the faith. And I'm not denigrating any of this, but I think that it fits into the great debate that we had before between the Counter-Reformation priests in England and the appellants. Here we set up the modern problem. Who are we, and how do we function within a society? We no longer live in a predominantly Christian society. This is a very hard cultural shift for most of us, or at least people anywhere near my advanced years. That, as a matter of fact, we grew up in a world where it was presumed that the Western world was essentially a Christian world. And in Europe, in France and in Germany and in Italy and in Spain, Ireland grew up with an understanding not only was it a Christian world, it was a Catholic world. Well, the cultural revolutions came as they came in England in the 16th century. And as they came in England in the 16th century, the confusion began. What are we supposed to do? It's legitimate to ask that question. It is legitimate to search for ways in which it means now for something that is new to us. How can we be faithful to the Church, faithful to Jesus Christ, faithful Catholics, in a world where we no longer have really any social support for what we do? When we see, for instance, in the realm of England under the reign of Queen Elizabeth, Elizabeth had her own issues and had her own problems. And so she tried to find a way to hold it all together. She couldn't come toward us because she was illegitimate and eventually because she was excommunicated. And she probably wouldn't have anyway, who knows. But she thought, well, one way to solve the problem is not to open windows into men's souls. Make religion a social phenomenon, a cultural phenomenon. And the most deadly and dangerous thing you can do is to have people really believe it. And in that way, it becomes a manner of control, a way to settle a confused society by creating kind of a uniformity of thought and a uniformity of practice. As we then, understanding this from our historical background, began to say, well, now what happened? Poor Elizabeth, her whole thing was shattered by the coming of these troublesome Counter-Reformation priests. And so she lashed out at them, and she wanted to get rid of them. And so she killed them. Because what else are you going to do with them? They actually believe something. This is unacceptable in a society that values conformity of thought and conformity of behavior. Take this now and take the modern Catholic Church in America and say, we don't have to go back to the Duomo of Milan. Take it and in some way, shape, or form, bring it into the American experience. What are we finding most terrifying? What are the powers within our society finding most terrifying? You believe something. That's right wing. That's hate-mongering. Just Rodney King kind of was the theologian of the modern culture. Why can't we all just get along? You know? Tone it down. Get hold of yourself. This, after all, they say, is only a personal thing. Why are you trying to impose your personal thoughts on the rest of us who just want to get along? So, we're going to pass laws about what you can say and not say, about what you can think and not think, about what you can do and not do in the social arena. I know, and I don't have a whole lot of time left, but I'd like just to tell a story that kind of illustrates this. There's a small liberal arts college that is terribly progressive that I have heard of, know about, and naturally the morality, the sexual morality, and all of this kind of stuff is, you know, it's modern. Well, some fundamentalist preachers wandered onto the campus and began to fulminate about fornication and how anyone who fornicated was going to go to hell. And he was very direct about that. He was arrested. He was arrested for hate speech because he had upset the students and made them feel bad. Now, this is not an unusual phenomenon. It is the struggle. We don't have to feel somehow or other that we stand alone in time. We have brothers and sisters in every age. And whatever the weaknesses and the failures of the Counter-Reformation clergy in England were? They were pursuing a vision, a dream. The vision and the dream was one they shared with the whole church. And they were willing to pursue it at the expense of their lives. And while the historical judgment on Robert Parsons is this: he failed. And we might fail in the same way as well. Who knows what lies ahead? But the fact of the matter is, he did not fail. Because there were those who came back to the faith. There were those who rediscovered their relationship with Jesus Christ. There were those who were able to feed on the Eucharist. And there were those who were able to confess their sins. And after all, what more is there for one human person to give another than that opportunity? Whether we do it in the realm of the personally and spiritual, whether we do it in the realm of the social, the political, the economic, however we do it, that's the mission of the church. And there is no amount of force or persecution that can take that away from us. There is an enormous ability within the Catholic Church to look and to seek everywhere. It is the depository of true freedom in the world. And we have no fear in union with the church to seek to ask any question. And what goes on in the great debates, the one that Msgr talks about in his article, these might be legitimate questions. But the fact of the matter is, we can learn something powerful from our ancestors. And the whole idea of turning back to the English Reformation is so we can ask questions. If you want to learn about the English Reformation, you can pick up a book. But if you want to ask the questions that raises for us in our faith life and in our modern world, then you come together and you search and you seek. And you try to understand that throughout all the ages and across all the continents, we are brothers and sisters in the Lord. And that what binds us together is not capitalism or socialism, not democracy or monarchy, none of those things. What binds us together is our faith in Jesus Christ, our solidarity as a people, our fidelity to the magisterial church presided over by the Bishop of Rome. Those are the things that identify us. Will we be accepted and everyone in society say, isn't that really great that that's the way they are? Well, if they don't, they don't. And if they kill us, they kill us. And you know, in the long run, Jesus Christ, the book of Revelation, assures us, triumphs over sin and darkness. There is no pessimism in the faith. There is only optimism and hope. And as those priests went to the scaffold, England even changed the name of the place. It was Tyburn, now I think it's Marblegate or Marblehead or something like that. Anyway, the Marble Gate, I think is what they called it. Marble Arch, that's it, you got it. And they changed the name to Covered Up. And if you go to the Tower of London and you say, where was Thomas More and John Fisher killed? They'll pretend they have no idea what you're talking about. And if you say, where is Tyburn? Don't know. But the fact of the matter is, those people were saints and they gave the faith to others. And that's what we're called to do. That's what we learned. The painting, the picture is there. The story is there. The relationship over the ages is there. We are who we are. And let us be grateful to God that He allows us to stay that way.